Matt, welcome into the back room.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, congrats on the success of the film. It's been nominated for 5 Emmys, count them, five, including Outstanding Documentary and Outstanding Directing. Tell me about the moment when you learned about those nominations.
I was in a meeting and I knew the announcement was coming and I was so excited to hear it, but also I had forgotten that Paul as an executive producer is a posthumous nominee. So that was very kind of
Hmm.
moving to me as well. I knew that would have meant a lot to him. So yeah, it took me a second to realize how many we were nominated for, but I was delighted.
It's such a good movie, and I have to establish the fact that I am one of the world's biggest Pee Wee Herman fans. So I really enjoyed it, and obviously it's a kind of an honor and a thrill to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
What drew you to tell the story of Paul Reubens and his iconic alter ego, Pee Wee Herman? Was there a personal connection or just a fascination, or as some filmmakers have told me, maybe just a big paycheck?
Not that. It was more, I grew up obsessed with Pee-wee's Playhouse. I would say it was probably the first art that I experienced as a young person, and I had a visceral emotional reaction to it. And it sort of became part of my DNA, you could say. Above my bed, I hung this pull string, the pull string Pee-wee doll that's pretty ubiquitous.
Hmm.
And, it was there through high school, and I, looked at Pee-wee every night before I went to bed. But as an adult, filmmaker, I'm not someone who's a huge fan. I don't relate to people through the lens of fandom. I'm pretty good at separating the artist from the artwork. But in this case, very little was known about Paul Reubens. But I was very interested to meet him and to pursue making a film about him. I had a sense that he was somebody whose, sensibilities and experiences resonated with my interests. I make a lot of films about unconventional visionaries, you could call them. And Paul was no exception. That said, he was much more famous than anybody I've made a film about, but
Hmm.
Pee-wee was famous, not Paul. So in a lot of ways, he was
Right.
sort of an artist hidden in plain sight, and I was interested in telling his personal story.
Well, it's an interesting this story you shared about your childhood because I'm curious to know when you first sat down with him for your first interview, knowing what you just told me, what was that moment like? Were you intimidated? Were you in awe? Were you, I mean, how were you affected by that?
Well, you have to realize before I interviewed Paul, we had had hundreds of hours of conversations.
Hmm.
The moment I met Paul, he said, I want to direct the documentary myself, but everybody's advising me against it, and I don't understand why. And I said, well, I'm here to talk to you about me directing the documentary, and maybe we can have a conversation to conceive of a process that you'd be comfortable with, and you could get to know me. And so that process of getting to know me went on for months.
Mm.
Hundreds of hours, literally, of conversations in which sometimes we were just shooting the shit and getting to know each other. Other times, they were tense conversations about what the documentary process is, how Paul would be involved, and to what extent he could shape the narrative of his story. And I was also learning his story because so little about Paul was publicly known. So when we sat down for the interview, I was well prepared and had a pretty established relationship with Paul. So I wouldn't say I was nervous. I was prepared and prepared that this could be a pretty epic long form interview. I knew that with Paul, there were no 15-minute conversations. Every conversation was invariably an hour and a half to 2 hours. And I also knew that Paul had an incredible recall of details from his childhood. And that obviously was an engine of his creativity. And I knew he'd want to go extremely in depth. However, when he sat down, I was taken aback by how resistant he was to the documentary process, and that manifested him sort of procrastinating or blowing off steam by making fun of me or telling jokes in ways that didn't relate to his story. And at first, I was concerned. I thought, how am I ever gonna how am I ever gonna get through this interview? Is he even capable of telling his personal story? And then my producer Emma Tillinger-Koskoff said, "This stuff is great," and I said, "Really?" And, in that moment, I recognized that what I was capturing was portraiture of somebody who was tricky and slippery, and also somebody who was wrestling with himself about how much of his personal life he wanted to share. And so I started to refer to that material as interview verite, or the kind of stuff we would typically observe in someone's day-to-day life, but through the guise of a conversation. And that interview would unfold over the course of 10 days for 40 hours on camera.
So you clearly did get a sense right up front that as a creative partner, he was going to be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I knew immediately the moment I met him that Paul was going to be the most challenging person I had dealt with, at least from a subject standpoint. Um, but at the same time, I was pretty determined to make it work. I really wanted to tell his story. Meeting him only intensified those feelings. And, I empathized with his concerns. Paul was someone who lost control of his personal narrative in the media. So, of course, the premise of this younger filmmaker coming in saying, I get to control your story, just hand over the goods, was very confounding to him. And I understood why. So, my approach was to be totally transparent and to involve him in the filmmaking process and to educate him about how documentaries are made. That doesn't mean it got easier, though.
And how long did it take you to gain his trust? Or did you feel like you didn't ever really get that trust the way you had hoped or wanted?
For a while, I thought the more studious I am, the more reliable I am, the more kind of I show up, copiously prepared, that I will earn Paul's trust. That's typically how I do it, by doing a lot of homework and really demonstrating that I take my job seriously to my subjects. But I recognize that Paul was different and that he might not trust me, or at least he might not trust me on the terms I was used to experiencing. So I had to just deal with that, and it's an important life lesson. Some people aren't capable of fully trusting other people for real specific reasons, and in Paul's case, it's self-evident, and you can still kind of manage a relationship with those types of people, and they can take leaps of faith. And Paul took a leap of faith with me when he decided to do the documentary, and much more significantly, he took a leap of faith when he gave explicit permission for me to finish the film before he died.
And so Pee Wee, and I guess by extension, Paul, is both whimsical and subversive. How did you approach capturing that duality in your storytelling?
I think that I see Pee-wee as being mischievous and kind of bratty and also incredibly sweet. And that's a big range of feelings. I think Pee-wee is someone who wears his heart on his sleeve. He can be cheesy and sentimental, but also biting and sarcastic. And the way I choose to represent that was through Paul, whose personality had a similar range, from being sweet and thoughtful and very sincere, and then being rebellious and sometimes mean. And so I wanted to show the full spectrum of Paul's personality because he was the creator of Pee-wee, and Pee-wee, in many ways, even though quite different from Paul, was a reflection of his temperament.
And was there something that really surprised you most about Paul during the research and the interview process, either personally or professionally?
I was surprised at what Paul's relationship was to nature and animals. That wasn't
Mm.
something I would have had any way to know. But whenever you went over to Paul's house, he would be feeding deers or crows with seeds and corn. And, he kind of cultivated this fantasia of wildlife who would roam around his property, which was on the kind of perimeter of Griffith Park. And I saw Paul's relationships to animals to be part of his tenderness. I wanted to thread that through the film. And it's interesting because Paul once called me and said, there's something about me that you don't take an interest in. And he said, it's my interest in biodiversity and animals. And I said, frankly, Paul, it's one of the most interesting things about you. So that was a surprise and also became a meaningful part of how I characterized Paul in the film.
Well, you alluded to this before when we are talking, like he's such a deeply private person despite his fame. How did you navigate telling such an intimate story while honoring that privacy?
Well, honoring the privacy, I mean, Paul was speaking to a camera knowing that what was being said would be used and seen by millions of people. So, in a way, I was already kind of assuming that Paul had reconciled the notion that his private life would be less private. That
Hmm.
said, he was struggling with that throughout the making
Yeah,
of the film.
clearly. Hmm.
And I tried to be supportive through that, but also to push him out of his comfort zone. And, a lot of what I would say to Paul is it's okay to be complicated. Nobody thinks you're going to be simple. Being simple is kind of beneath you. Of course, you are complex. You need to embrace your complexity. And I think he took that to heart in a way and allowed himself to share things and express himself in ways he hadn't done before publicly. And, I had no idea that Paul had been battling illness. So I'm sure questions of mortality were in his mind. And
Hmm.
Paul was an incredibly charismatic and gregarious person. And I think he wanted people to know that side of him. I think he wanted people to see how Paul's sense of humor is different than Pee Wee and to really get a full, complex, and nuanced portrait of who he was as an artist, not just as Pee Wee Herman.
Yeah, it's so interesting because what I took away from a lot of the back and forth was that he did genuinely seem to want to tell his story, but there was just something inside of him that just naturally made him put up his walls. That,
Yeah.
at times he broke the walls down. You helped bring the
Yeah,
walls
that was
down.
a dynamic process of
Hmm.
retreating and coming forward, of kind of leaning out and leaning in, and just sort of I think wrestling in real time with
Yeah.
a certain kind of ambivalence about being known. And, I think a lot of people would feel that way. If I were to interview you for 40 hours, I don't know if you'd feel comfortable sharing all of that. But, Paul's relationship to privacy and anonymity is very different because he had made this, life-changing decision early in his life to separate himself from his creation and to kind of, vigilantly protect his privacy.
There was that cat and mouse like aspect to your conversations with him, which I enjoyed. At times they were a little cheeky and confrontational. Did you enjoy that dynamic? Was it frustrating? Both?
I wouldn't say I enjoyed it. It was frustrating at times, but it also clearly was strong material for the film. Paul
Hmm.
did, and so did I. So I wouldn't say it was a performance, but I was open to him blowing off steam by taunting me in certain ways or by, rebelling against me because it was part of who Paul was, and it was great material for the film. Did it test my patience? Yes.
Well, it's interesting what you just said. Do you think it was performative on his part, or was he just genuinely cheeky and a little bit defiant and confrontational?
Both. Paul's a performer. So I think
Hmm.
naturally his instinct is to perform, is to make people
Hmm.
laugh, is to control the nature of his voice and his face. That's who he is as a performer, as an actor, and as somebody who dodged people kind of inquiring about his personal life. But I think the Paul that I saw in those interviews was the Paul that I knew. And I was incredibly relieved that he was able to be that way with me.
He clearly was someone who needed to control things, to certainly control his narrative. And as a documentary director, where control, right down to final cut, is so crucial to telling the story you want to tell, I would imagine that was quite challenging on many levels. But was there like a moment where the two of you, just needed to say, okay, let's stop. We need to walk away, come back, and try to
It
get
was
through this
more,
moment?
it was a gradual process. Conflict over control was ongoing from the moment I
Mm.
met Paul through the making of the film. And, I do see documentaries as being highly collaborative. They're not just, I do whatever I want, you give me everything.
Hmm.
You rely on your subjects to be engaged and to have shared stakes in sharing their stories and their materials. And that was certainly the case for Paul, but the boundaries were always being crossed in a way that made me uncomfortable. And as I said, from the get-go, Paul was totally uncomfortable with the premise of somebody else having the authority to tell his story, on with Final Cut, which I did have. So it was an evolution of him kind of having more and more anxiety about the process, particularly as he realized that documentaries are really made or written, for lack of a better word, in post-production. And so, it came to a head. and Paul didn't want to continue doing his interview. I did these interviews in blocks of days, and we took a break, and we didn't come back to do that final interview. And we're trying to find a path forward for a while.
Did he try to give a lot of specific input or direction? Like how did he try to assert himself in that regard?
Yes, he wanted to be involved in all aspects of the film, from, the position of the camera for everybody's interview to the telling of the story. And my approach was to be transparent. I had nothing to hide. What I
Hmm.
wanted to do aligned with our shared goals of telling a story. But Paul, as an incredible artist, is by, no surprise controlling. And also, I think, there was a larger feeling of loss of control of his story in his life and through this process. And these little nitty-gritty details, which are fairly inconsequential in the bigger picture, were things that Paul was really focused on because they were things that he could control and things that I could acquiesce on so that he would feel more at ease in the process that was a bigger kind of leap of faith.
In the good, bad, and ugly of life, he certainly had his bad and ugly. But yet the Pee-wee character, and again, by extension, Paul himself, has had such a lasting cultural impact, one that seems to, in fact, be growing as each day passes. What do you think it says about American pop culture or just Americans in general? Like, to me, it seems like they're just so forgiving and we appreciate art and we're able, in a way, to separate the artist from what the artist may or may not do in his or her personal life. And why do you think he endures over time like the way he has?
I think most of the general public doesn't care about the controversies surrounding Paul's first arrest in an adult movie theater. I think it feels provincial now compared to the other tabloid fodder that we're, kind of immersed in day to day around celebrities.
Hmm.
I think there's a kind of consensus that what happened to him was unfair and unreasonable. So I don't think there is an aspect of forgiveness per se. I think, all I can go off of is the reaction to my documentary, which has been so visceral and so emotional. And I think
Mm.
that people have a kind of internalized emotional response to Pee-wee's Playhouse. It was something very formative to them, either that or Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Paul's feature film. And watching this documentary and going through the origin story of the character, but also the specific anecdotes and details from that show, I think has helped people reconnect to how formative that was. When you're a child, so you can't necessarily, you don't have words to explain why you love something or how it's affecting you. As adults, we're able to look back and recognize how significantly the values and messages of Pee-wee's Playhouse, radical acceptance, nonconformity, creativity. For many of us, those are kind of fundamental aspects of who we are, and Pee-wee created a space and a language for that changed us. I think that's why his legacy endures.
So I want to put you on the spot and try to force you to explain why you think as a child you loved Pee-wee's Playhouse so much. What was it about that show and him that grabbed you that way?
I think the whole environment was very queer. I think as a gay person, seeing a
Hmm.
childhood figure have a wedding and marry a bowl of fruit salad feels very gay to me. And I think there was a lot of gay innuendo that I probably wouldn't have been able to recognize as a kid, but that was there. And
Hmm.
I think the whole notion of nonconformity and acceptance, anyone who felt different and creative, that was a catch-all. That was something that felt safe and felt alternative and felt like a different world than the one you kind of inherited and were growing up in. And that kind of thing for a young gay kid was major.
It's so interesting. Like I started watching it as an adult and I immediately saw the innuendo, the double entendres, and I was like, wow, this is really smart because kids love it, but like it's easy to see how this is going to be a big hit with adults
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
And it became this phenomenon. And now I have three grandchildren. I have
Wow.
under 6 years old, and so I show them an episode of Pee Wee's Playhouse. And my 6-year-old granddaughter, who's kind of sassy, I'm watching her as she's watching it, and I kept saying, "Do you like it?" And she's like, "Hmm." Like she didn't want to give me the satisfaction. And so when it was over, I said, "What'd you think?" She goes, "Weird." And I was like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. It is weird.
that's the whole point." And
That's
then
part of
so
the
the
appeal.
I said, would you watch it again? She goes, I don't think so. And the
Yeah,
next night at bedtime, I said, all right, let's read a book tonight. And she goes, can we watch another
oh,
episode of that?
yeah,
What
yeah,
was
yeah,
that show you showed me? I said, so you like it? She goes, I don't know. I just, want something different. I was like, you liked it, didn't you? And
yeah,
she was transfixed because, and I tried to watch it through her eyes. Like the stuff that's happening in that show is it's mind-boggling. If you
yeah,
just sort of like watch it, if you take your eyes off of him and just look at what's going on and the colors and the movement, I mean, it
yeah. It's
is
overstimulating. It's
genius.
captivating.
You know,
It's beautiful. It's visually beautiful.
he was truly such a visionary. Do you believe people underestimate his genius, or is he over time starting to get that acclaim that he
I don't
deserves?
think people underestimate it. I don't think people knew the kind of deep thinking and the array of cultural influences that fed into that character. I think people know the character and appreciate it, but that appreciation is enhanced when people have a deeper sense of context for who Paul was and all the different cultural forces that converge to create Pee-wee. And that was part of my goal in making the film. Part of what I shared to him is I want people to have a deeper appreciation for you, not just as a comedian or entertainer, but as an artist.
Mm. Do you think the more controversial parts of his life will always overshadow that genius? Like, is, quote, disgraced former actor Paul Reubens always going to be his legacy?
I think the
And
documentary, frankly, is changing that a little bit. I think
mm,
people, particularly in the media, are more self-conscious or critical about that being the go-to, or that people who may have had a generalized impression of him being, unsavory have context for that. So I hope very much that the documentary changes that. I know that was one of Paul's reasons for wanting to do the documentary, but also, people gravitate to the salacious. And that will always be a footnote to Paul's story.
as you mentioned before, he died before the interviews were completed. And this is, of course, pure conjecture. But do you believe, had you had that last interview with him, that you may have further cracked his wall, that you may have gotten more raw emotion, more vulnerability, some deeper revelation, contrition, perhaps?
Documentary filmmakers are always dealing with the limits, the limit of material you have. And I'm not a very speculative person, but I had 40 hours of incredible material to work with. Like, what a gift, 1,000 hours of archival
Hmm.
footage. So yeah, I could have had more, but that would be greedy. Well, I had what I had, and it was pretty extraordinary and revelatory. And so, yeah, I don't really speculate on what would have happened if the circumstances were different, because these are what the circumstances were, and they were extraordinary and very intense. The responsibility to make use of this without Paul was a heavy thing, and I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to interview him.
Well, I am going to ask you a speculation question because you mentioned before, like what you were feeling when he refused to do that last interview. And in that moment, in real time, if someone said to you, relax, you're going to get 5 Emmys nominations, like, could you have possibly in that moment felt that this is going to go to that place?
No, never. I really thought the film was falling apart. So no, never. It's the film came out like 2 months ago or so, and it's still surreal. Every day it's surreal that the film exists on these terms. It
Mhm.
doesn't get more normal.
Do you have a favorite moment in the film?
Yeah, the scene in which Paul recounts his relationship with Guy, his boyfriend,
Hmm.
right after art
Hmm.
school. It's my favorite scene I've
Hmm.
ever made in a movie.
Yeah, no, the revelation of his personal life that way was really touching and very poignant. What do you want audiences to take away from the film, especially younger generations who didn't grow up with Pee Wee?
I want people just to have an appreciation for Paul as an artist and to recognize the kind of sacrifices that he made to bring a kind of message of self-acceptance to you. At the end of the film, little Pee-wee's flying in a cape and he says, "I'm the luckiest boy in the world. I'm going to bring all my luck to you." I mean, Paul also says toward the end of the film, I was a vessel. And I,
Hmm.
I think there's something very moving and also poignant about that artists, when they do things that change the culture, that have a transformative effect for their viewers, particularly children, there's an immense amount of sacrifice that goes into that. And I hope that people will think about that when they appreciate not just Paul or Pee-wee, but other artists who have had a big and major impact on them.
Hmm. Such a great film. What are you working on next? Anything you can talk about?
I'm making a documentary about the world of soap operas. I've been behind the scenes at the Bolton
Oh,
Beat for the past year.
man, you're just like following me around in my head, aren't you?
Love it. We'll have to talk again when that film comes out, but I just finished shooting.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start editing in September, so it'll be a little while.
When I was in college in 1983, literally I would cut class to watch General Hospital.
Oh my God, I love it.
So yeah. Again, the film is Pee-wee as himself, and it can be seen on HBO Max and streamed and all that good stuff. Congratulations again. Good luck with the Emmys, and we'll be rooting for you. Come back again and talk with us.
Thank you,
Soon.
Andy. Have a good day.
Alrighty. Take care.